Thank you. Good morning. Today is Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023. This is the third and final segment of Senate Natural Resources and Energy morning meeting. We're looking at Bill S80 and activating some miscellaneous environmental conservation subjects. And we just finished a walkthrough with Mr. O'Grady, and now we are turning to East Natural Resources to have a walkthrough with explanation of the rationale behind what's being proposed. So that, I'd like to welcome back to the review, Ms. Smith. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you. Good morning. For the record, my name is Hannah Smith. I'm an attorney with DEC, and I think I will be joined eventually by the commissioner. He was giving testimony in another committee. He'll come down as soon as he can. I don't want to duplicate O'Grady's efforts here, but I'm happy to. I will walk through some of the explanation, answer any questions that I can, and then there were a few changes that I had sent late last night, so I can discuss those proposed tweaks to the language.
And have you sent those changes to Mr. O'Grady as well?
I did. Yes.
Okay, great. So I'll ask him to put them in the form of an amendment to this, and we'll go from there.
Okay.
Oh, these are they.
I had sent them as highlighted sections.
Yes.
And
Thank you. You all.
And Mike did actually identify there was some language I included that had been amended last session. So I think he might have corrected that, but either way, he and I can work together to make sure we've got the same.
Okay, so we'll get it straightened out in terms of process, but there's an amendment to the bill, and thank you for providing this. Okay, so I guess let's go through again, as you said, with explanations as to why, what's going on, why the agency's proposed.
Sure. In section 1 here, this provision deals with session law enacted as part of Act 161 of 2018 that amended the dam safety statute. And there was a reporting requirement and a rulemaking requirement, and we're asking for an extension of those dates. And it's really just a matter of capacity. The dam safety program is essentially 2 people. So we adopted phase 1 of the rules, which was, they were administrative requirements for dam inspections. They rewrote the hazard classification requirements. The agency adopted that phase 1 of the rule on schedule. The second half of the rule are technical standards for that are required to be met when a dam is inspected. It's a slightly more in-depth rulemaking process. The program is working really diligently with stakeholders to make sure that the technical requirements that they include make sense for Vermont and comply with federal requirements and are consistent with the Army Corps' requirements. We are on track to get that rule adopted by July of 2024. So we're asking for a 1-year extension to get that rulemaking completed. The reporting requirement on the dam registration process, which was required as part of phase 1 of the rule, we're also asking for an extension of that to 2025 because it won't really be until the rule is fully adopted that we can report back on progress that landowners have made in terms of getting their dams reported and getting the hazard classifications updated.
Thank you.
So that was section 1 and 2, dealt with those requirements under the dam safety rules. Section 3 looks at this change in the definition of public waters. It just references for encroachment, the definition of public waters that's used in the Shoreline Protection Act for consistency's sake, not a substantive change. The language in section 4 related to salvage yards proposes the use of a mobile crusher for the purposes of closing a salvage yard. And this is to allow, I think that we as DEC and the waste management program deals with a lot of violations under the salvage yard certification program. And we found that the most efficient and effective way to address those is really to work with landowners to get them cleaned up if possible. And so this would just allow folks to actually come into compliance, use a mobile crusher even without a certification. One change that I had sent to O'Grady that we're asking for is the language previously just said that if you don't hold a certification of registration, you may operate a mobile crusher for the purpose of closing the salvage yard. The agency would ask that the language be changed to say that you may operate a mobile salvage vehicle crusher in accordance with rules adopted under the subchapter. The program does have they have salvage yard rules. For the purpose of closing the salvage yard after notifying the secretary in writing of the intent to close the salvage yard. So just clarifying that you do in fact have to, there has to be a record that you've
Not like
notified the
anything
secretary.
goes.
Right,
Yeah.
you can't think it into being, yeah.
Okay.
You have to, there has to be a record, yeah. Section 5 is that we are looking at some of our revolving loan fund authority here. The first section is dealing with authority to spend and report. On page 5, there is this inclusion of money from the fund established in subdivision A1. So that's the EPA revolving loan fund. Those are the federal funds, and we're including that fund in the monies that can be dispersed. In addition to the Vermont Wastewater and Potable Water Revolving Loan Fund, inclusion of these funds allows, so the agency obviously is limited in terms of what we can spend money that was collected as a result of fees. This, including the federal revolving loan funding here, allows us to allocate more money towards program operating costs. We can only use the fee money for program operating costs. If we're allowed to use the federal funds for this loan funding program, we can allocate more money towards operational costs. The amendment further down in this section in 2A, it refers to both the EPA Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and the Vermont Drinking Water Planning Loan Fund shall be administered by VEDA. This is just a clarification that VEDA can disperse loans from this fund for private entities for planning purposes. The intent was always that VEDA would administer it. We just hadn't explicitly included the language.
This is kind of practice, but it wasn't explicit before.
Right. Again, on the next page, there's, I believe this is page 6. The C there on line 7 includes Vermont Environmental, the EPA Pollution Control Revolving Fund, and the Vermont Wastewater and Potable Water Fund may be administered by community development financial institutions. Again, this is just clarification that both loan funds can be used to administer loans in accordance with section 4763. Line 15 of that page just updates the header for 24 VSA chapter 120 subchapter 2 to municipalities and individuals to clarify that these loan funds can be dispersed to individual applicants.
This is more support. So last spring, there was an allocation that we increased at the end of the section that helped people who had failing septic and potable water systems. Many who were low income and had no capacity to make fixes, to receive funds, grants to do that work. Is this part of that same effort in sort of expanding the eligibility so that you can get to more individuals as opposed to just sticking to municipalities, the old-fashioned way we've been doing it?
The language that's in this bill is primarily clarification of that reallocation. It doesn't expand the program because there already is allocation allowed for municipalities and individuals. This section of statute, I think if I can discuss with Neil Kamen also, because he's really the expert here and I don't want to misstate anything. But a lot of the proposals this year are really just corrections to the language to clarify where the funding is coming from. It doesn't expand the program.
Okay.
So amendments to 4757 on additional uses for the revolving loan funds. The only change is on page 8, starting on line 3. It includes this reference to the EPA pollution revolving fund for the Vermont wastewater and potable water revolving fund. This clarifies that we can actually use the administrative or the federal money, the EPA revolving loan fund, to pay costs associated with the administration of the funding. Again, this is just a clarification. It allows us to use funds from both of these funding sources for administration.
With clarification, so this is something that's already current practice, but now made explicit.
I believe so, and I can verify that for you.
Thank you.
The amendments beginning on line 8 of page 8 to 4763B. This is loans for failed wastewater systems and failed potable water supplies. The first change to this section is at the top of page 9, line 1. We're striking through the requirement that an individual be denied funding before they're eligible for loan application. And this was, previously there was this provision that required denial and the agency doesn't think it's necessary. The next change to this section began on page 10, starting with line 4. This language is, it parallels the language, this is, sorry, I can specifically, it's 4763B subsection B. It parallels the language in subsection A. It walks through the requirements for applicants for loans to pay for failed wastewater and potable water supply systems. But it applies specifically to money that's funded through our federal clean water service provider loan, so the EPA revolving loan fund. So it's very similar to the language in subsection A, but there are a couple additions that reflect federal requirements. Page 10, line 19, the loan may only be made to an owner who demonstrates sufficient means. This is a federal requirement. Sufficient means to pay the principal and interest, federal requirement. Beginning of page 11, subsection 4, the loan may only be for a project that's a clean water project that the secretary has designated as a priority. Again, this is a federal requirement, so applicable to any funding dispersed from the federal EPA Clean Water Fund. Further down that page, beginning on line 18, loans are awarded at or below market interest rates. That's a federal requirement. And then subsection 9 there is a federal requirement, again, that applies only to this section because it's talking about repayment of loans being deposited directly back into the EPA revolving fund.
Thank you, Chair Bright. So if I'm understanding correctly, the impetus for some of these changes, if we did not make these changes, would we be ineligible for certain federal programs or?
It's not an issue of eligibility, but we need to require these for disbursement of the federal funds. And so we wanted the statute to be explicit about what applicants are required to provide in order to be eligible for funding from these sources. And there is a distinction between what's required funds dispersed purely from our permit fee funded revolving loan funds versus a federal revolving loan fund.
So that makes me feel that this is very obvious language,
It's
perhaps?
pretty definitive.
Yeah.
B is aligns very closely with A. but it includes additional requirements that we're required to implement in order to disperse federal funding.
Thank you.
Beginning on the top of page 12, subsection C, this alone is awarded under this section. It would apply to both A and B above, so both funds from the state fund and federal funding, but we just included them both here. The federal requirement here is that the loans shall include a loan repayment schedule that commences not later than 1 year after completion of the funded project and shall not be used for operation and maintenance expenses.
So these are capital investments, not operating. This is not money for operation, but money for
Right.
capital investment.
Moving on, if there are no other questions about the revolving loan fund section. The clean water reporting amendments, these are pretty straightforward. The first one, the report on treatment practices, as Mike O'Grady mentioned, we switched from calendar year to state fiscal year to align with our other state fiscal reporting requirements. So this is consistent with the Clean Water Initiative annual performance report reporting requirement. They all look at the fiscal year rather than the calendar year. One other amendment to that section. So on middle of page 15, starting line 45, I believe, this pushes back the summary, the summary of the administration of the grant programs that the state will provide from 2023 to 2024. And one thing to note about that is that under the Act 76 grant programs, those go into effect in 2023. And so we actually, it's not an intent, we're not intending to avoid reporting, but we just will report in 2024 on the data we've collected this year.
So I'm looking at the one that as introduced versus the amended one. So there's a whole section.
Yes.
It's highlighted beginning of page 13.
This highlighted section, this was a result of some cross wires. We weren't sure whether these amendments had been made last session, and they were. I had stuck them in there because I wanted to make sure they were covered, and the changes to 1386 were updated last session.
Okay.
So they were taken care of.
The requirement of it looks familiar. It's familiar for real. Okay.
Yes, and I just didn't, we had a lot of, I was coordinating a lot of moving parts.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, that last year, I mean, to your point, part of the reason we're doing this with extra back and forth is in the closing weeks of the session, portions were omitted from that bill.
Yes. But some things did move forward, so I just needed to cross-check what actually was adopted last year. The same thing with the highlighted section at the bottom of page 15. Those amendments were made last session.
How about top of page 16, same thing?
Yes, same thing.
Okay.
Bottom of page 16, beginning line 70, this talks about the report on recommendations on nutrient credit trading, and it pushes the deadline back 2 years just to give the agency capacity to develop this report. And I do know that there is a final draft of this report ready. I believe the Clean Water Board, this will be presented to the Clean Water Board this week, but the proposal to push the date back was, it was proposed earlier when we were developing the language of this bill, just to give the agency the time they need.
Do you want to, since it's going to the board this week, do you want to leave it? Is it then going to come out?
I would like to leave it. I don't know if they're going to need further time to provide revisions.
Okay, so,
I'd like to leave the date, as 2024, sorry, to
Yeah.
the proposed proposed date.
Okay, so I'll flag it as something, if it's going to the board now, I don't know if that means July of this year, that it'll be signed, sealed, delivered, or it might still be in process.
Beginning on the page 17, the middle of page 17, these are changes to ANR's enforcement practice provisions. And as Mike O'Grady explained, we do have consolidated enforcement authority that's articulated under Chapter 201 and Chapter 220 of Title 10. Specifically, 10 VSA 8003 walks through all of the programs that we have enforcement authority over. And this is an attempt to sort of consolidate those enforcement provisions. There are differences between these particular dollar amounts that are articulated in these sections versus the penalty calculation that's done under Chapter 201 for our administrative enforcement provisions. So I think that's an important point to make here. The idea, though, is that we would just be using one consistent penalty calculation for violations that we're enforcing.
So on line, oh, I see, okay.
And I've highlighted it because, as Mike O'Grady alluded to, we're proposing that instead of a reference to that specific provision, 10
Right.
VSA 8003, we are actually referencing the entire chapter. The chapter includes both 8003, which walks through the programs we have authority over, and it includes the statutory authority for issuing administrative penalties and citations. So it's a more broad reference to our enforcement authority.
Seems like it might be a more durable cross-reference than just
I think so.
the other.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So the amendment to 1527, this is a fine assessed under the bottle bill. The amendment to 6697 is a fine assessed for the single-use plastics. And then on the next page, 18, beginning with line 6.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
That suggested, oh, okay, so you're also changing up here. You also changed the cross-reference to chapter 201.
Yes.
And do you know what that might mean practically speaking? You know, these were, those penalty provisions were modified because people were very worried about was, you know, we're gonna have thousands of violators and all the rest. I mean, it actually rolled out very smoothly, and I'm not aware offhand of any enforcement other than somebody checking in with someone saying, are you aware this law exists? And then someone coming into compliance just by being asked. But do you know if we've ended up finding or taking it?
I'm not aware of
Okay.
enforcement actions taken under the single-use plastic provision.
Do you know what the penalties would become by virtue of this change?
So that's a good question, and it depends on how enforcement proceeds. So there are two routes. If there's a violation, a major violation or an ongoing violation, we'll typically pursue a case where we're assessing administrative penalties. There is a penalty calculation done based on the nature of the violation, the extent of the violation, et cetera. We also have citation authority, which allows us to basically issue the equivalent of it's like a traffic ticket. But that's typically cases where the violation's already been corrected. It's something that we've talked to the violator, they've come back into compliance, but the violation was severe enough that there is some deterrent value in issuing a citation associated with that violation. The citation penalties are much lower. I believe the maximum is $3,000 for the worst offense. And I can provide you with the exact numbers. I don't know off the top of my head what the minimum waiver amount is for the citations. I think it's $300. It's a couple $100. They are higher than the amounts contemplated in
Sure,
this provision now.
which would make sense, given that it's a well-established law at this point. So, you know, understand.
Yes, and the penalty calculations that are included in both our administrative assessment and our citation process, of course, apply across the board to all environmental violations. So it's more of a broad range we're looking at, and there's, depending on whether the case is pursued through the environmental court, it's a much more in-depth evaluation in terms of determining what the penalty should actually be. They look at all the factors involved, intent, yeah. Then the final provision that updates the enforcement language begins on page 18, line 6. This amendment is to 24 VSA 2282, which is related to salvage yards. And the agency is proposing a tweak to this language because the $5, not the less than $5 or nor more than $50, right now that penalty can be assessed by either the legislative body of a municipality, so that's defined in Title 24, I believe it's the select board or the city council, or the agency. We're proposing to leave that language in there for the legislative bodies of municipalities, so as to leave their penalty assessment authority intact, and then add a sentence that says the person who violates this subchapter shall be fined by the Agency of Natural Resources in accordance with 10 VSA Chapter 201.
Senator Watson.
Is there a reason to not, again, cite the entire chapter?
Well, we would like to cite the entire chapter for the agency's
Oh, okay.
enforcement authority.
Okay.
What we're doing is, I think that the language that was in the last draft of the bill struck through entirely the less than 5 or more than 50, and just referred to the agency's Chapter 201 authority.
Mhm.
We'd like to leave that first sentence intact. So a person who violates the subchapter shall be fined by the legislative body, referring to the municipality, not less than 5 or more than 50. But then it has a second sentence that just describes the agency's enforcement authority.
Cool, thank you.
The solid waste certification language that's on the middle of page 18. This did come up when Michael Grady was walking through the bill. It strikes through this sentence, or this section deals with disqualifying criteria for the agency to issue a certification to somebody either operating a solid waste facility or acting as a solid waste hauler. And the strike through is for a waste transportation permit under section 6607 of this title. The agency does still issue the waste transportation permits. What the strike through does is basically it would eliminate the need for waste haulers to get a background check. So the agency does the background checks. This is a substantial burden for us. And when we're doing the background checks, we're also only picking up on state crimes. In addition to it being a burden for the agency, it's somewhat of an equity issue because it's disqualifying individuals with misdemeanors from receiving waste hauler certifications. And that is the agency's strike through.
Did you know why that provision was included from, why it got inserted once upon a time?
I don't know the specific reason. I think that generally we listed all of the certifications we issue for operators and haulers as requiring these background checks. And I think perhaps it was experience running the program. It wasn't necessary for haulers.
So besides burden, Are you all feeling that it really anything of significance, therefore it's a wasted effort?
Generally, the burden far outweighed any benefit we receive from uncovering unqualified individuals, yes.
Yeah, thank you.
The next section deals with the agency's permitting notice and comment requirements. This would include under the type 5 permitting requirements, the emergency construction general permit authorizations. This one's pretty straightforward. Those are only issued as the language states when the authorization is needed for discharge of runoff related to emergency construction activities. Those are activities necessary to address imminent risk to life or risk of damage to public or private property, including damage to lifeline infrastructure. So anything that allows you to make a 911 call or for an ambulance to reach you, it's lifeline infrastructure. With emergency permits issued under the type 5 protocol, there actually is no notice and comment period. The agency just issues a notice of final decision. The permit's been issued. And then beginning at top of page 20, there's this again refers to the lake encroachment permits, that the permits issued shall be effective on the date that's signed rather than 10 days into the future. The next section here, section 16, beginning middle of page 20, it does strike the requirement that the agency posts this information on its website when they've determined that water is not potable due to the presence of contamination. I believe this was just determined to be a duplicative effort. I would offer if the commissioner has any additional insight into this, the requirement that they no longer have to post information on potable water supply contamination on the website. I think that was just determined to be unnecessary.
Yeah, for the record, John Beal, Commissioner, that's correct. It just was, not sure why it was in there in the first place, and no one really saw that it had really any valid purpose.
Is that information otherwise available to the public? So that's, as you say, duplicative.
And then,
Sorry, back up. How else would someone learn that? How else would a member of the public who perhaps had a public health concern in a neighborhood or something like that be able to find out about that if it's not being posted?
I can confirm and get back to you.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That would be helpful.
The Petroleum Cleanup Fund Assistance Program. This is line 18 of page 21. As Mike O'Grady referenced, the agency is requesting that all the language in H229 be incorporated into this bill. And the 229 is related to, it clarifies authorization of disbursements under the Petroleum Cleanup Fund, basically raises the cap for amounts that can be dispersed and expands the eligible projects that are eligible for funding. I don't know if I would be effective at walking through all of that language right now, but
Sure.
if the committee decides to include that in this bill, agency can provide additional testimony on that language.
I would just add, for the record, that language is based upon a report to the legislature from the PCF advisory committee, and they were the ones who made these recommendations, so that there is some, we can get that to you.
Okay, great, thank you. I think Senator McDonald served on that for a long time. Is the 229 language as introduced from your point of view final language, or
believe so, yeah.
So we can get rid of that.
The final section of this bill is, again, a highlighted section that the agency is proposing. This is beginning on line 10 of page 24. There's currently session law on the books. This was from Act 185 of 2018. And it's a sunset of loans issued to private entities for clean water projects. I believe that the sunset was initially adopted. There was some concern about whether funding would continue to be available for municipalities if individuals were also eligible to apply for funds. This has not been an issue for the agency, and we would request that the sunset provision be repealed. As Michael Grady alluded to, I believe it's House Corrections is very interested in this particular language.
So this will answer read, and I see there's now on page 25, line 21. So can private loans under 24 years equal 20? Yes.
Sorry to go back. Thank you. To go back a bit. On page 22, line 2, and then 10, getting up to speed on this. This is part of the Petroleum Cleanup Fund Assistance Program. So that first change there is for someone who wishes to close, replace, or upgrade a tank, or replace the heating system with an advanced wood heating system or heat pump. But this is particularly for folks that are in mobile home parks.
So this is Petroleum Cleanup Fund Assistance Program.
Yep.
And this is a farm or residential heating fuel storage tank.
Yes, and
Those are
on
Oh,
line
yes.
21, yeah.
on-premises heating by a mobile home park resident as defined in section 62 of WEC.
Wondering, I'm perhaps unsurprisingly all for advanced wood heating systems and heat pumps. We did hear some testimony that particularly mobile homes are. Sorry, I'm going to try to make this shorter. Wondering if the agency had contemplated other complementary infrastructure upgrades that would allow for heat pumps in mobile homes, because a lot of times the infrastructure for like piping and whatnot is underneath, and so heat pumps can be sometimes problematic. So to use a heat pump that might require like skirting around the base, it might or just any other protections that would allow the mobile home to actually, so beyond just the heat pump itself, like the other necessary infrastructure to make that work for a mobile home. Alternatively, or in addition to, like, there's also like, this is sort of beyond, it's like another order of magnitude more expensive, but there's a program that replaces mobile homes with more high efficiency modular homes that would be able to take heat pumps more readily. Anyway, just wondering if there was any other considerations for additional pieces there.
The money dispersed from this fund currently, and even with this language, is limited to assistance with replacement of your heating system.
Yeah.
And I would have to look more closely at the requirements for eligible projects, but it says, the statute says broadly that the money is available for those who desire assistance. To close, replace, or upgrade, or replace their heating system. So I imagine that, I would have to look more closely at the language, but assistance with replacement of a system could include the necessary components of that system. But it wouldn't be eligible funding for actual housing, mobile home.
The replacement,
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would, that's fair. And so coming back to the idea of like skirting or insulation for, space underneath. So thinking about the replacement of a heating system as potentially including the necessary elements to actually make that change for the home.
I can look into what the requirements are and provide a more detailed answer on that.
Super, thank you.
We've also, there are other programs too, like whether it's a assistance program, and this might dovetail with that as well, like that. Because I don't think they've been allowed to upgrade heating systems, they've been allowed to weatherize, but not replace heating equipment. I was starting to ask because when I read the very last section, it wasn't familiar to me, so I wasn't sure if you could sort of back up and give a beginner's explanation for the sunset of loans to private entities or suspension of private loans for clean water projects. It's all being struck in the first half. And then there's an intent section. And there's a statement about reviewing it during 2023. So I don't know if you know this proposed change well enough to say, what was the problem? What's the issue? What are we trying to do here?
When this provision was adopted in 2018, there was substantial revision to the various revolving loan fund. Sections were moved from Title 10 to 24. There were updates to the language around the revolving loan funds the agency administers. The sunset was inserted so that in 2023 there could be an evaluation of whether there was still available money. The concern was that municipalities would lose out if the funds were also being dispersed to individuals. So I believe that the opportunity to review was there to take a look at whether municipalities were still receiving adequate funding for clean water projects with this new allowance that funds be used for individual disbursements.
So has the experience been that municipalities had reasonable access to funds, even though individuals were allowed to go on the same fund?
Yes, that's been the experience.
Thank you. So I'm flagging my check with the institutions committee. We used to have Senator Rogers on this committee, who also served on institutions. So he was our liaison to the, when we talked about funds in here that were of interest to them, he could carry water back and forth, but we don't have that connection anymore. Any other committee questions for Commissioner Greeley or Ms. Smith? Okay, thank you. All right, who would like to report this? All right, so we'll No, sorry.
What did I miss?
So for things flagged, I'll check in with Mr. Brady about getting together an amendment that gathers those up. a
Okay.
Single amendment, and then including H229. So we'll have one-stop shopping, and see about amending this bill. And then we'll be inviting other folks in to testify. I don't know if there's any areas of controversy. I'm not aware of any, but other than the institutions committee, maybe we can think differently about these things. So that's it. Anything else that we didn't ask about that you want to point out while you're visiting? Okay.
I think that we covered a lot of ground. We appreciate the time.
Okay. It's really good. New belt and suspenders this time around. Make sure we get everything into one place at the same time. Okay. Great. So thank you very much for coming in. Good to see you. And so any further business? Anyone? We're done a little early, but
Not on this one, it's just what is the chair's intention on the salt bill?
honestly, I had sort of thought through exactly. I just wanted to move on to take a break from S5. So these are bills that seem like we might have time to get them up and move them prior to crossover because they're pretty well contained. Thank you. So
Because I do have witnesses.
okay. So if you can provide Jude with witnesses,
Yes.
then we can start to build a list of people to come. And I think there's been kind of a chloride working group. I know Mr. Carpenter is.
Yeah, no, you're part of it too, and we would very much appreciate if you could take it up before crossover. It's like, keep it alive. We can also have witnesses who can provide.
So if you as well could provide names to Jude for suggested
Sure,
witnesses,
thank
that
you.
would help us
Appreciate that.
jumpstart. Center one.
Yes, and if I have witnesses that might be interested in the PFAS bill, I should also send them to.
Sure. I think the PFAS, I think the PFAS one is, well, I don't want to forecast entirely. I don't know if we end up moving that prior to crossover. or not. And not because the bill itself is not fine. It's that there are like all these other threads people woven in. Like we've been looking at food residuals and PFAS, and we've been looking at treatment of leaching, and then there's been talk about what goes into the landfill. And so, but it's definitely something we're wrestling with on an ongoing basis. Thank you, Mr. Brady, talking about what level can we regulate, under what paradigm, if it's very strange to have people varying their level of regulation by 6 orders of magnitude under different programs. So it's like, wait, what? It doesn't make sense. And at first, like, I don't know how to sort that one out. What makes sense for us to do it. But so let's keep talking about it.
Yeah, sure.
Because maybe there is something useful and relatively compact that we can do. I'd also like to make sure we hear from that working group that was looking at fats and plastics, getting into the food residual stream, because then it gets into compost, which we would like to think is a great resource. It may have more contaminants than we thought. Right, anything else in the world of new business? Or we have an H bill, but that'll be post crossover. Yeah, the other, we did introduce S21 and S22 about hosting land and safety zones. So might also be compact enough to be bills that we could move prior to crossover. We have 3 in the pipeline now, and 17th of March, which is crossover. Okay.